Hi, my name is Vacation, and with the recent announcement of Skyward Sword HD and subsequent uproar of Nintendo's laziness, I figured I would put my voice out there. A month late and to 17 subscribers. But I was a stinky teenager when the game first released, I've always been a proponent of emulation, and I've made a controller configuration that took up to 2 weeks of my life in the beginning of quarantine. I want to address some of the issues people have with the game, either justifyingly or not. First of all, Skyward Sword is a fine Zelda game. It takes the formula of the linear 3D Zelda adventure established by Ocarina of Time in 1998 to the absolute breaking point 12 years later in 2011. It traded the past 3D Zelda's pretense of an open world to focus on a more objective-based, moment-to-moment gameplay while holding the player's hand and putting blinders on their eyes. This makes for some genuinely fun and creative puzzles, with some memorable set pieces here and there, but it sacrifices any sense of player agency and hampers any sense of discovery and wonderment found through interacting with the game's mechanics. This is not a review, so I'll just say I think Skyward Sword is just mediocre. It's a below-average Zelda game, but I'm a Zelda shill, and I believe that a below-average Zelda game is still a pretty good video game. What I'm saying is, there's more room for improvement compared to the past Zelda titles. I want to look at the other ports, remasters, re-releases, whatever you want to call these, and go over the improvements and changes Nintendo added or took away from the games. The reason for a remaster is to 1. Introduce the product to a new wave of customers, and 2. To fix things that were wrong with the original product. I think Nintendo holds true to those two mission statements, but with one caveat. If you're an optimist, I think that they may believe in their work a little bit too much. If you're a pessimist, they do the bare minimum in order to avoid the argument that they did nothing to improve the game. Let's take a look at their previous re-releases. Ocarina of Time 3D was overall a better experience than emulation when it was released, and a better experience wholesale than the Nintendo 64 original. The only downside is that it was only available on a portable system. For Wind Waker, I believe it became the definitive experience even with the terrible bloom. With Simu, you can effectively get rid of the bloom effect via emulation. Now, Majora's Mask was odd. It did not become the definitive way to play the game. It created this weird situation where no one version did everything best. Emulation has since fixed those problems, though I have not tried that version out myself. I highly recommend Nerrel's video on the game if you're interested. Now, Twilight Princess is where things get, boring. It's kind of whatever. To be pedantic, this feels like a direct port rather than a remaster or a re-release. It's kind of the best version of the game, but only by default, as it did nothing to address any of the issues with the original game. Also, I want to mention, before I recap, Link's Awakening is not on this list as it was not a 3D entry and it was more of a full-fledged remake. Anyway, we can learn two things from the past releases. 1. People will pay full price for a Zelda remaster on the system it was released for. And 2. Nintendo can't help fixing things that weren't broken. With the exception of Ocarina of Time, none of the remasters are a straight improvement over the original. Wind Waker improved so much that people should just deal with the HD shortcomings, Majora's Mask breaks certain mechanics in such a bizarre way, and Twilight Princess HD just kind of exists. It features no massive overhauls in either gameplay or its visuals, and it's almost the same experience that came out for the Wii and the GameCube 10 years prior to its initial release. Twilight HD is just the most convenient way to play the game. Now, with Skyward Sword HD, can they still get away with that? The bare minimum? As I mentioned before, I believe that Skyward Sword is the weakest of the 3D Zeldas for issues that do not include the motion controls. The pacing is horrendous, the difficulty is laughably easy, Fi is incredibly patronizing, the sky is barren, the Imprisoned and Tantalus look ridiculous, and the harp is tacked on and confusing to use. A lot of these would require a decent amount of work to fix, and I don't believe Nintendo is willing or incentivized to do that. Fi could simply just not activate her text whenever it seemed redundant, and I'm sure they did something with the harp with the new controls. However, The other things I mentioned are things that are not so easily fixed. Wind Waker HD was able to modify the Triforce quest to be less tedious, but Skyward Sword, in my opinion, needs entire sections of the game cut or remixed with existing ideas, like the last harp song quest for example. The Imprisoned and Tentalus would need, at the bare minimum, a huge texture rework and at most a full-blown redo. The fact that the Imprisoned is a recurring boss and he has these goofy marshmallow toes is baffling, to be honest. I don't see how a group of people thought to put those two bosses into the game with this beautiful of an art style. Speaking of art style, let's touch up on the graphics. Skyward Sword on the Wii had this beautiful art style that mimicked impressionist painting, blah 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 blah, you heard this all before. But playing this game on an emulator at modern resolutions really showcases how well it has held up over time. People always say how Wind Waker has aged so well due to its art style, but I think Skyward Sword has aged just as well, if not better. So, graphically, I think if they just used higher res textures like they did with Wind Waker and Twilight HD, I think it would look fantastic, and that does seem to be the route that they're going. What I am very excited for, however, is the chance to play this game at 60 frames per second, something which you cannot do via emulation. So, the price. Is a barely above average game from 10 years ago worth buying at full price because it added a control option that should have been there in the beginning and it runs at 60 frames per second? Depends on who you are, but mostly no. Remasters appeal to a pretty unique audience, so I want to go through some straw men and women that I've built up. 1. You played the game 10 years ago and liked it. Probably not worth it unless you want to trip down memory lane. Doesn't seem like they are adding any significant quality of life improvements because the modified controls are enough of a selling point. 2. You played the game 10 years ago and didn't like it. If you didn't like Skyward Sword because of the motion controls but found the story intriguing, sure, get it. If you thought the game was horribly paced and thought the combat rarely went past swing your sword in the direction the game is clearly telling you to, then you might want to skip this one. 3. You've never played Skyward Sword before. It is one of the more divisive Zeldas, but definitely worth a playthrough if you like the others. If you don't want to support Nintendo and their non-consumer friendly business practices, buy it used at some point. 4. You love Zelda. You already pre-ordered the game and those slick Joy-Cons. I'd be mad at you if I wasn't jealous myself. Those things look pretty sweet. I believe most people who are even considering getting this game fall under categories 3 and 4. With zero evidence backing this claim, Skyward Sword seems to be the 3D Zelda that the least amount of people have played. At the time of release, it required an upgraded Wiimote and had controls that alienated a lot of people, either through just being a horribly ableist control scheme in general, or people just didn't like the idea of motion controls. Personally, I'll be picking this up when it releases, as the 60 frames per second improvement is something that I cannot get through emulation, and I want to see what they did with the controls. Before its release, I plan to update or modify my original control scheme, as I've gotten a bit better at video editing, and Steam has improved Steam input quite a bit since I last made that setup. Also, when the game is released, as I did with the Galaxy games, I'm going to try to translate the Switch controls over to Dolphin. So, that's the video. This is my first attempt at an opinion video, so please tell me what you think. I'd love to get a discussion going on in the comments, as these issues need to be addressed in our world today. Hope you enjoyed the video, even if you didn't agree with my opinion. Well, have a great day.